Thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IISS. Thank you for being here in London this afternoon, and thank you for our friends who are following us online. My name is Francesca Grandi. I will be chairing the conflict briefing today. I'm a senior fellow at the program on conflict security and development here at the Institute. Please come in. I'm also the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, our annual publication that surveys all ongoing conflicts around the world. It is my pleasure to be here with my colleague Andrew Tchie this afternoon, who will help us make sense of the recently signed peace agreement in South Sudan, and also what are some major trends and priorities that we should look into for the months to come. Dr. Tchie has recently joined the IISS after having worked as a civil affairs officer at the UN in South Sudan and as a conflict prevention advisor, correct, the UNDP in both in Uganda and Nepal. And he has received his PhD from the University of Essex with a research on the indiscriminate violence against civilians. Usually we do have a senior and a junior experts for each conflict, but unfortunately our armed conflict database analyst, Ms. Chedine Tazi, is not able to be here with us today because she recently moved to Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and we tried to establish an internet connection to have a conversation with her as well, but that was also not possible due to technological challenges. So what we did was to record a video through which she will give a context and a background on the conflict, and then we will move on to more recent trends and developments with some questions I have for Andrew. As usual, our conflict briefings are conversations, but also we strive to make them as interactive as possible. So we really invite you to ask questions once Andrew has given his take on the few issues that I will be raising with him. Also, we strive very much to have your feedback on the type of research and conflict-related, policy-relevant research we do here at the Institute. And so we really treasure your feedback and advice on that. So please feel free to give us your feedback, your advice after our conversation today, but also online at any point you feel that might be relevant. As we talk, Andrew will also show you some graphics that have been prepared based on the data that we collect through the armed conflict database, of which Andrew is primarily responsible, but which rely on a vast network of contributors who are based both in London and overseas. So without further ado, I will ask Tom to show us the video that Chedine recorded, and then I will have some questions for Andrew. Welcome again.
South Sudan is trying to emerge from a devastating conflict that has been going on since 2013. So 2 years after the country's independence from Sudan, there were tensions that started to emerge within the SPLM party, the ruling party, and the political rivalry between President Salva Kiir and his then Vice President Riek Machar led to a division of the army along ethnic lines, which in turn led to civil war. In 2015, 2 years later, the conflict parties signed a first peace agreement that quickly collapsed, and in 2016, the country was back into civil war. 2 years later again, in 2018, the parties were back at the negotiating table, and they signed a revitalized version of the peace agreement in September. The parties are in the process of implementing the peace agreement for now. There are technical committees confidence building activities that have been put in place, but the process is actually behind schedule. There are logistical issues, financial issues, and also ongoing mistrust that are preventing the implementation from going smoothly. There are also problems in terms of monitoring. Recently, we saw attacks on monitors who were trying to see whether there was still recruitment and training going on in the army. For now, we can say that violence has decreased since the signing of the agreement, but we can't really say whether it is really due to the agreement or whether it's also due to the rainy season that usually slows down fighting. That being said, there's still fighting going on between the government and parties that did not sign the agreement, but also between the government and the SPLM in opposition, which is actually a signatory of the agreement, and it suggests that the leaders are not in complete control of their ranks as of now. It's also important to note that it's not all the rebel groups and opposition parties that signed the deal. And in fact, after the signing of the agreement, what we noticed is a lot of defections and splits within opposition coalitions and rebel movements. Some of their members wanted to join the deal, but some others defected because they were rejecting the agreement. And President Salva Kiir has decided to treat the non-signatories as spoilers of the deal, and this could justify further offensive against the non-signatories, and we could see further fighting in the near future. Apart from this, there are a lot of attacks on civilians going on and communal fighting. Sexual violence also remains a major concern. Last November, Médecins Sans Frontières reported a massive wave of rapes against women and girls in the area of Bentiu. The government denied that such things happened, especially because some of the women reported being raped by men in uniforms. For now, the South Sudanese population is quite wary of concluding that peace has been achieved in the country, just because people are remembering too well how the first deal quickly fell apart, and people are also still bearing the heavy cost of the conflict. The humanitarian situation and the displacement situation are disastrous. There are 2 million people that are displaced in neighboring countries, and also 2 million people displaced within the country. In terms of food security, the situation is very dire as well. 2019 is actually expected to be one of the worst years, if not the worst, because a declaration of famine is expected this year. And it's mostly due to the cumulative effect of the years of conflict. People are just waiting now for the actual end of clashes, for guarantees that peace has been achieved. They're waiting to see the economy improving in order to go back to their homes and in order to feel at peace in their own country. So the deal establishes a government of national unity for a transitional period, and after that there will be elections, and this structure is quite similar to the previous peace agreement. There is a power sharing component, so there will be 5 vice presidents, including Riek Machar, who will return as the first vice president, so it's also pretty much like the previous deal. There is also a structure of 550 members of parliament, which is huge. It's supposed to accommodate all the parties, but in practice this is a very inflated structure that is going to pose problems in terms of efficiency, in terms of the mere cost of paying everybody. In terms of security arrangements, the deal reaffirmed the permanent ceasefire. It requests from troops to withdraw from civilian areas. This is likely to be done only in surface because the government has very little incentive to take the risk of removing its troops from key places such as the airport. This is likely to create tensions with the opposition parties after the pre-transitional period. It's likely to create problems. The deal also provides for the unification of the army and its redeployment within 8 months. That's quite ambitious. And the unification would actually change the ethnic balance of the army, which is currently dominated by Dinkas. So it's very likely that what we will see is a partial integration of the army instead of a full merger. The deal also requests from armed forces to canton their troops, but the process is quite unclear and it has created misunderstandings and tensions because opposition movements already started to canton their forces before the official start of the process, and this is creating clashes pretty much like in 2016. Other provisions of the deal include the rehabilitation of oil fields that were damaged by the conflict, and it gives a lot of power to Sudan and Uganda in the process. These 2 countries will be the main beneficiaries of the resumption of oil production, as well as oil companies and the signatories of the deal and the South Sudanese government. But most likely we're not going to see the South Sudanese population benefiting from the resumption of oil production. But finally, the deal leaves a lot of contentious issues unresolved, especially the number and demarcations of internal states. A few years ago, President Salva Kiir increased the number of states from 10 to 28 and then 32. And this created a lot of ethnic tensions inside the country. The state's demarcation seems to favor the Dinka population. And the deal doesn't really address that. It sets up an internal boundaries committee, but it hasn't been set up yet. And the issue is likely to be very contentious in the near future. Another very contentious issue has to do with accountability and transitional justice. Actually, the agreement provides for the establishment of a hybrid court, which would prosecute the perpetrators of human rights violations. But it's very unlikely that this is going to be implemented anytime soon, especially since the brokers of the deal themselves have been involved in the conflict, Uganda and Sudan. And the main signatories themselves, they don't want to see their leaders being prosecuted. What could set this deal apart compared to the previous one is the involvement of regional actors in the peace process. So Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir was the chief mediator for this peace agreement. But given the history of war between Sudan and South Sudan, there are of course still tensions going on between the two countries. We can say that Sudan is far from a neutral mediator, especially because Omar al-Bashir has been accused of interfering in the conflict by supporting the South Sudanese rebels. But actually, this proximity with the rebels might have allowed President Omar al-Bashir to convince Riek Machar to sign the deal. And also, Sudan has a direct interest into making the deal work. Sudan could hugely benefit from the resumption of oil production in South Sudan because the oil is transiting from Sudanese pipelines, and also the government has big shares in the reconstruction process. In addition to this, al-Bashir is really keen on making the deal work because Sudan is trying to rehabilitate its image at the international level and also regionally. So this role as a mediator could improve the country's image. That being said, President Omar al-Bashir is currently severely challenged in his own country because of the wave of anti-government protests going on in Sudan. So if he's seriously weakened or removed from office, this could destabilize the peace agreement in South Sudan because al-Bashir is one of the main guarantors of the deal. Overall, we can say that this peace agreement could be stronger than the previous one because of the involvement of regional actors who have an incentive in making the deal work. But that being said, there is still a lot of contentious issues that have not been resolved by the deal. So it would be very optimistic to say that the peace agreement has actually brought peace in the country.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to Chedine for this excellent introduction and background to the conflict. So many challenges there. Let's start with the peace agreement itself. So, will it stick? What are its main weaknesses? Chedine has mentioned some of them. What are some of those outstanding issues?
So, I think, let me start by just saying I don't think the agreement will stick, and I think there are sort of 5 thematic areas or 5 thematic reasons why. The first is it really at the root cause of, or should I say, the root cause of the conflict hasn't been dealt with. So this is the reform of the SPLA, now the SSDF. South Sudan is a failed state, and I think we have to accept that. And also, when you are dealing with a failed state, you have to put in the right mechanisms to be able to support that state, and that isn't currently put in place. I think to a degree, aid has fueled a lot of the conflict that you're currently seeing at the moment as well, and that's something that is not being addressed. Corruption is thriving, as Chedine has pointed out, and again, you see corruption at different levels. So the vice president recently being paid $135,000 to furnish his house. These sort of acts do not support the agreement, but also don't support the process of peace. So the large question is no, and I mean there are several reasons. I'll just go through some of them. Since last year alone, in 2018, there were 31 to 33 defections by different rebel groups, and that's just in the year of 2018 alone. So you can imagine you're dealing with a fragmented country, fragmented conflict, in which you're trying to get parties together to actually form some sort of peace agreement. And so for me, many of those parties weren't brought to the peace negotiation table, and so it's unlikely, because of that, that peace will hold. The other reason is that you have 7 peace agreements, and so over the course of the last 8.5 years, there have been 7 peace agreements, all of which have failed. Even the last but one, which was in 2017, the day of the signing, the armed groups were fighting amongst each other. And so, again, with these sort of indicators, will the likely peace agreement hold? No, I don't think it will. The other thing to also mention is the agreement in place now is weaker. Me and Chedine disagree on this, but it's weaker in the sense that the mechanisms that were put in place in 2015 are not there now. What I mean by that is IGAD, African Union, and all of the sort of other regional bodies that were, to hold the South Sudanese government to account. Those mechanisms are no longer in place, and so actually what you have is a government who is able to do what they want without actually being able to be held accountable for their actions as well. And that's something else that makes me think actually the agreement won't hold. Chedine flagged this up, but the sort of 5 vice presidents, I'm yet to see any country with 5 vice presidents. But that creates more problems in agreements, more problems in trying to get to the sort of the nuts and bolts of the sort of dealing with the agreement, but also implementing it going forward. So that's another thing to note. Weapons are still making their way through into South Sudan through Uganda. Again, another concern. There is no DDR plan in this agreement, so no active, strong DDR plan that says these are the sort of steps that we're taking. I was basing the power, the latter point of the peace agreement there, and you could see that cantonment sites were allocated by the UN. Troops are pulled into those cantonments. They went through their sort of training and rehabilitation. There's been none of that. Even the SPLA hasn't even actually allocated any of its cantonment sites, and that was supposed to be done 3 months ago. What is interesting is that the SPLA, IO, and the opposition groups have come together and agreed 23 sites, but there's 14 total that need to be agreed on. So they're already behind on that aspect. The other big thing is there are fragmentations within the SPLA-IO, which is the main opposition group, but also that the return of Machar, it may actually cause violence, and that's something that hasn't been taken into consideration. In July 2016, we saw an outbreak of violence, and that was because the security sort of aspect wasn't dealt with, and that's another concern for me going forward. Land disputes. I originally was in South Sudan in 2015 to 17. When I first arrived, we had 10 states. We now have 32. There's talk of 38 at some point.
How is the issue of land disputes linked to this state formation?
Well, land disputes, what you see is during certain points, so this is sort of the outbreak of the conflict in 2013, what you see is that the creation of states actually has some impact on, as it were, the formation of new groups. And so each time there is a declaration by the president saying, look, we're going to create more states, actually what you see is more groups emerge from each time. And so actually the process or the decree by the president is counterproductive because it's not actually helping the process. Particularly because as more states are created, you then have to really fund these groups, fund the states, fund the governors, because actually it's not independent people that are put in place, it's governors, and governors who are aligned to the SPLA, who are generals. And so actually, all you're doing is really, propping up people that are within the SPLA, and that doesn't support peace, and it doesn't support the sort of local cohesion on the ground. And actually, what you're seeing is, particularly in places like Upper Nile, Unity States, the Equatorials, where they've been split, what you actually are seeing is that ethnic groups are being divided, and you're seeing groups who have been moved out of areas. So, while Shuluk, for example, on the western side of the Upper Nile, you have more Dinkas now there who historically were never ever placed there, and so you see this sort of displacement going on in certain areas. The Equatorials, for example, it's not a Dinka heartland, but actually what you are seeing is more Dinkas in that place as well. So actually, the decrees that the president puts in place are not working. As I said, last year alone, there were 31 defections, and this is all part of that problem. And if the sort of president continues on this path, you will see an outbreak of violence, more so than you saw in 2016. But I'll touch a little bit more on that later on. The recent attacks that you see in Equatorial states. So this is just a video that from our dataset, conflict database, which indicates all of the armed clashes in 2018. So the yellow are the armed clashes. You have defections in a particular area. And I've used a 10-state system so you can see sort of the land masses of where things are placed. And so the western and central Equatoria is where NAS, which is led by Thomas Cirillo, is based. What you see is more armed clashes in these areas, particularly January. You see the government forming with the SPLA-IO. That is also creating splits within the SPLA-IO, particularly for Unity State and Upper Nile, because those states are supported by the opposition. And so that doesn't help sort of the dynamics of what's going on the ground, but also creates further fragmentation between the groups in the country as well. The other concern is with the agreements, it doesn't hold all parties to account. So if a party is using violence, there is no mechanism in place to actually hold them to account. Individuals are not really sanctioned. There were some sanctions last year, particularly against the Israeli general and a few SPLA better word, investors, but nothing beyond that. There's nothing really in place by the international community to actually sanction individuals. And that, for me, is the next step that should happen. Actually, sanctioning the country doesn't really help, but the individuals who are the ones causing the violence, because we know who they are, and it's very clear. I mean, if South Sudan is run by generals, then it's actually targeting those generals who are the ones implementing the violence as well. So the other last two things just to touch on is the root causes. Again, the agreement itself is more about power sharing. It's more about disseminating power to the various generals, to the various parties, but it actually doesn't get to the crux of the issue. So, for example, as I said before, the SPLA is this issue of the SPLA pretty much from the 1980s has been issues all the way through now. That divide between the groups, between the different ethnic groups, even before the SPLA, is the same continuation of the problem that we're seeing now, and that root hasn't been addressed. It won't be addressed because the peace agreement doesn't allow that. And so, to a degree, if the peace agreement had said, the SPLA should think about reforming, probably not that sort of language, but along the lines of creating more federal states, during, let's say, a given period, then that would have helped, some way to support the peace agreement. At the moment, that isn't there. And the last sort of two areas is the lack of regional accountability. What we see is Sudan and Uganda pretty much having an involvement as they did before. But again, Uganda has been caught recently training snipers and sending troops into the Equatorial to deal with the NAS, the opposition groups who didn't sign up to the agreement. You have Johnson Aloni, for those of you who know Upper Nile. Once you hear Johnson Aloni start to mobilize and move, then there's a problem, because actually he is from the Upper Nile region, and he's born and he's a Shuluk, but knows the land very, very well, and is very able to quickly mobilize. And the tensions that you saw in 2013 and 14 between the SPLA and Johnson Aloni's group was actually initiated by him. So when you start seeing these key generals or players moving, then for me, it raises alarms. But also, again, the peace agreement hasn't been held to. The ceasefire in 2017 and the current agreement that's in place has been violated several times, and nothing has been done about it. So for me, the peace agreement won't hold, and those are some of the key indicators why.
Thank you. Thanks for that. You list many challenges. If I understand correctly, it's a peace agreement that is not really grounded in a serious ceasefire that is agreed upon. It doesn't really have mechanisms for demobilization and disarmament. What it mostly does, it tries to give power to more veto players, and it keeps multiplying the number of these veto players. Yeah. So, against this scenario, what are the first things that we should be doing in order to salvage this peace agreement?
I don't think you can salvage it, because pretty much this agreement is a copy and paste of the 2015 agreement. Okay. Like I said, the problem is with this agreement is the sort of mechanisms that are in place to support the 2015 agreement, which didn't succeed, have been removed. And so I think one of the things that I'm always aware of, having worked on the ground in other countries, is that whenever you're dealing with conflict, there must be a moment of ripeness, so a moment when all parties are ready and willing to negotiate at that table. That hasn't happened here, and what you see is a repeat of what you saw in 2015, where regional partners, and possibly because of the Troika states, have said, actually, violence has gone on for too long, deal with it. But actually, that moment of ripeness, that moment when actors say, we are ready to come to the table and we're serious about this, hasn't taken place. And so what you will see is a repeat of the violence again in 2016, 2015, and potentially even worse than it was before. And so for me, it's not salvageable. I think the other problem is many of the key players internationally who are working on this are forcing things through, and so they're not allowing the key actors and players within South Sudan to actually understand and get there by themselves. They're sort of forcing that down their throats, and there's a fine balance between what you can and can't do as a negotiator. But again, it's sort of saying, okay, actually this needs to happen now. If it doesn't happen, then we think this is the route. And actually, it's about the South Sudanese people finding their own way, their own mechanisms to support peace. And one of the things I've been advocating for is really for that lower end. Before, when I worked with the UN, is for that lower end, localized sort of ways of engaging with the local people, bringing them together and supporting peace that way. Because actually, there's no point in spending millions of dollars on the leaders who end up spending money in Uganda, have all foreign passports. None of them are. Most of them have Australian, Canadian, UK, US passports, but yet still don't put anything back into the country. And so the local mechanism, the women, peace and security element really needs to be something that I think local actors and international community really touch on.
Yeah, this seems the themes the UN claims to be addressing, sort of uniting this more high level and this more local level peacemaking, but how is that working? What is the UN actually doing? What about the mission that's been deployed in the country since 2011?
So the mission itself, I think, at various levels has worked well, and at other levels hasn't worked well. I think. Okay, let me separate the two. So the sort of civilian aspect, I think, has done really well, and again, engaging with people, political affairs, civil affairs, really trying to engage with the people on the ground, the communities, work to bring, create partnerships to resolve some of the conflict, the local sort of pastoral, but also cattle raiding issues that have gone on the ground. They've been instrumental in really sorting those issues out. I think where the UN hasn't done well has been at the peacekeeping level and the peacekeeping troop contribution countries. Sorry to say this, but particularly those in Southeast Asia have been reluctant to engage and to enforce Chapter 6 and 7. And so one of the things I observed when I was in Malakal, Upper Nile, in 2016, when the attacks happened on the UN base there, was that certain troops from Southeast Asia were reluctant to actually engage and stop the incident happening. And actually what happened was many of them just ran away from the incidents. And that's this sort of idea of robust peacekeeping is something that I think UMIS has always lacked, partly because of the way in which South Sudan is structured, getting around, being able to set up forces and bases of where they're placed. They haven't really done well in, or they have had bases, but those bases are left empty. But also because, and the other thing is the constraints. The UN equipment is old. Most of the tanks that they do have, or equipment, are from the 1960s and 70s, post-Russian era. You can't do peacekeeping on the cheap, and so investment in that area is needed, and that's sort of the crucial thing for me. The other thing is that where the mandates have changed and the situation has changed, the two have always been, or the mandate itself has been lagging behind. So the situation changes, but the mandate is a year and a half behind. And so you have a mandate. When I arrived, we were still doing DDR, when actually everybody was wanting that there was violence about it, but yet still we're focused on DDR. And so it's the mandates catching up to the situation, and whether the mandates are every 6 months or every 3 months, whatever works. But the mandates have to be relevant for where the conditions of where the troops are, but in situations what they find themselves in. And that's another thing that hasn't really worked. There's been attacks on UN personnel. Again, the government in particular particular, the UN has been very quiet, so there'll be attacks on personnel, the UN doesn't say anything. And that sort of allowing this to happen over the years, the last 5 years, contributes to what I would say fragmentation of the UN's role, but also responsibility to be able to hold the parties accountable. The lack of support, I would say, definitely from the UN Security Council over the last probably year and a half, 2 years, they've been a bit more firm, but in past they've been very weak. And recently, it seems like the sort of willingness to engage with the government hasn't been as strong as it could have been. So that's another thing. Things like failure to protect civilians when it comes to sexual violence, absolutely rubbish at that. You know that there are women going out to certain areas. You should have those protection civilian forces there to look after those women, to protect them. That isn't done, and oftentimes the UN has always come from a position of reactive as opposed to responding ahead of time. So again, knowing the data, knowing what's going on, for me, what I would like to see is the UN saying, actually, there are clashes in the equatorial regions. We know NAS hasn't signed the agreement, but actually, should we be putting troops there on patrol to support some of the civilians? You had 7,000 civilians who fled over the border to DRC last week, but yet still the UN didn't do anything. It was down to OCHA and DRC to resolve this issue. When we all knew this was happening, we knew this was coming, but again, nothing has been done to deal with that. And so for me, those are the things. Robust peacekeeping, I think, is the key word for me. And a
more proactive attitude,
yes.
Certainly. Thank you very much for that, Andrew. A bit more in general, maybe. What can the international community at large contribute to this process? What are the priorities, really, that you would say are the most important to face and to address the most pressing challenges?
I think there are several things the international community can do. I think it must work with the SPLA to sanction more individuals. I think that's key because, again, a lot of the money is being passed through the individuals, but also because it's the individuals, really, the generals at the state levels who are the ones who are helping to mobilize this violence. And so, again, holding those generals to account. For example, Paul Malone, who used to be part of the SPLA, who's now defected to the SSUF, holding him to account for some of the violence that he has conducted in South Sudan is one of the key things. Holding the president account and saying, actually, your troops have been found committing this violence. Recently, a UN report on the violations that happened against women, the rape cases last year, December, found that the vice president, Taban Deng's troops were involved in that violence. Again, holding him to account. You've also got the issue where he's been corrupt with the 135,000. Why aren't we doing more to hold, to place sanctions on him to say, actually, these two incidents or these two cases are against you, sanctions are put on you. Again, we're not doing that. So I think it needs to be able to help support the reforming of the SPLA, but also hold those parties to account. I talked a little bit about going local. I don't want to use the word local as in going local, but sort of supporting more of the local peace efforts on the ground. That's key for me, really trying to support the women, peace and security aspect of civil society, and that needs to really happen. Mechanisms to support the DDR. There is no real DDR plan in place, so again, what can be done by the international communities? What can the UK government do to send its experts, panelists or people who know the context and know what's going on to actually support some of those local issues, but also build up the local communities and the local sort of divides that support the local support strengthening the local issues that are on the ground. I think the other thing is, and this is something that I'm mindful of, and not everybody would like me for, but I think pushing for elections would be disastrous right now, considering where we are, considering the amounts of violence that have been used, the clashes in the Equatorials. Going for elections would be nothing but problematic because it would only mean that you will create more displacement, particularly in those areas where the opposition groups haven't signed the peace agreements. We're again seeing that in the equatorial regions where people are being pushed out. We saw that in Fashoda, in the western part of Upper Nile. We saw that in Unity State again. So for me, pushing for elections in the next 2.5 years is very stupid, and we shouldn't go down that route. What is required is the reforming or making sure that the SPLA or the SSDF can be reformed, that it becomes a political party, and supporting that process, and then after that pushing for elections. But going for elections right now, where there are so many fragmented groups, is a disastrous issue, and something that I think it would be silly for anyone to support, and I don't understand why it was in the peace agreement. So. But there you go. And just to warn, I think if there are elections, I think you could see it being more bloody than it was in Kenya in 2008. Sorry. The other thing is, I think the international community could hold bilateral talks with other key players, really trying to engage with them, talking to them on the side to find out what's going on, to really try and give them the sort of support that they might need, particularly some of the parties that are doing some really good things on the ground. And I think that's a way forward as well. It could support more the monitoring mechanism. So, for example, IGAD, JMEC, which has been obviously recommissioned, and UMIS, really trying to speak out against the violations that happen to UMIS staff, JMEC staff, but also those from the CSTM VN, which is the ceasefire monitoring group. Again, really trying to support them and saying, actually, these violations have been used against you, we stand up against it. Those things go a long way in South Sudan, and they mean a lot. I talked a little bit about the technical structures, so again, really trying to focus on the local level, rebuilding those technical or structural issues, structural capacities that have been broken over the years of the conflict, pretty much non-existent, because if you think about South Sudan, it's pretty much never been a state on its own, and so you need to build up those local identities, those chiefs, those local systems that have been destroyed throughout the conflict, and really try and push that forward. I think that's where the international community can really support the people of Sudan, and again hold up breakout talks, or further dialogues with sort of the groups that didn't sign. IGAD has been very good in doing that with NAS TC, but again holding more talks with these opposition groups, finding out what their concerns are, how we can bring them around the negotiation table, what more dialogues can be done are really key.
Thank you.
And so just those things.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to open the floor now to our audience, and maybe we can go back and elaborate more on some of the issues that you mentioned. So can I please ask you to introduce yourself, tell us your name and what organization you work for, or in which role, or anything that you think is relevant about your research and your work, please. Thank you. The lady in the front.
I'm Hayley Davidson from Press Section. Thanks very much. That was a really amazing overview. You made a really compelling case for saying there needs to be more work done to sanction individuals, and saying that we know who they are. What's your assessment of why that isn't happening? What are the barriers to that?
That's a good question.
Can I also add to that, actually, because it was part of my question. So how would that look like in your opinion? Because it would be interesting to actually understand maybe more the mechanisms that could be used and leveraged for that.
I think what's happened with the international community is the willingness to actually engage more on with these leaders it's fizzled out. The momentum since last year has died down, and I think people are just sort of fed up and said, actually, well, they're just going to keep on fighting, so why bother? I think the reason why I'm advocating for sanctions, I think, is because what it does is it ties in sort of the money issues, that the individuals are able to gain through this, and it holds them accountable to say, actually, you can't travel to these countries, you can't do these sort of investments or other things that they might want to do. And I think that's important, because actually what it means is that it sends a signal to the leaders and the governors and the generals of South Sudan to say, actually, we are going to hold you accountable for the violence that takes place in your areas. That hasn't happened. And I think that needs to happen more, because again, it's about holding not just the president accountable, but actually it was the whole entire international community that says, we want to support South Sudan given independence. And if you're going to do that, then you have to follow through the whole entire way. And I think that sort of lack of momentum doesn't help. But again, holding those individuals to account, say, you committed that violence, you were the perpetrators. The UN report says this solidifies the UN's findings, but also the work that other organisations are doing. And so you need to be able to hold it. To be able to do that, you need to be able to sanction those who are committing that violence. And if that doesn't happen, then what's the point of having this peace agreement in place?
Yeah. So it would be a combination of sort of name and shame, but also more enforcement mechanism, more clear ones, such as travel bans, for example.
And there has been a few. I mean, the sort of president's, I think, brother-in-law has had recent sanctions on him for the involvement of the Israeli General, last year for bringing weapons. And so there are sanctions on individuals, and the US could do more, definitely. It's been slightly quiet on that end. And so really trying to target those and saying, actually, the agreement says this, your troops, for example, we know that the UN human rights investigation says Taban Deng, the vice president's troops, were involved in the violence against women, the rapes of the 172 last year. Why isn't sanctions being placed on the vice president?
Thank you. Please.
Lawrence Cockcroft, Transparency International. You made a very interesting comment that you thought that this was an agreement that was superficial in the sense that the protagonists weren't really ready for it. But I wonder if you could comment on to what extent Kiir and Machar are really free to negotiate. Is it their decision, or are they responsible to a whole hinterland of interest groups and they can't move without getting those interest groups on board?
I think it's less about the groups on the ground and more about the regional players. And what I suspect, again, this is not with don't quote me as in theoretical arguments or evidence that I have. What I suspect is a lot of the sort of the agreement. One of the reasons why it was pushed through is linked to Sudan. So the sort of Sudan's economy at the moment, which is not doing well, and I think Bashir saw this as an opportunity really to try and make, as it were, money to sort of bring up his economy again, because again the South Sudanese economy has suffered since the oil was shut or fighting broke out in 2013. So part of that is linked to that. The other thing is, I think a lot of it is around resources. So the Equatorial regions particularly are in interest for for Uganda, Museveni, particularly because again those resources can be used as a way of making, propping up its economy, but also supporting some of the stuff that he wants to do. And actually, in fact, South Africa has actually cut a deal between China to drill pipelines from South Sudan through into Ethiopia to export oil. So for me, it's less about the actors on the ground, because the actors really they can be bought off. That's nothing different than has been done before. It's more about the regional players and how their roles impact what's going on the ground.
Thank you. Please.
Oliver from King's College. I wonder if you could add something on DDR, maybe the challenges and the future, and also the role or the position of the African Union.
The role of the African Union. All right, so I'll start with the African Union. That role is basically nothing.
That's a quick answer.
It's been weak throughout. It makes statements. It doesn't do enough. Look, last month we had a briefing on DRC. It made a statement. SADC reversed that statement. For me, I have massive concerns about the African Union, and I see their position and their power weakening, and pretty much I think it's really about the regional players or the regional groups. So, for example, take ECOWAS, very strong in dealing with the situation in West Africa. I think that sort of model seems to work better in South Sudan, particularly not necessarily with IGAD, but more so with the regional partners bringing them together. It doesn't support the sort of overall peace path that you would want, but I think that's where the power lies, and it does African Union. The African Union will just get overturned each time. I mean, for example, its chair now, its secondary chair, is Felix Tshisekedi, who was the one, where they claimed that the elections were fraudulent. This is not a system that works for me, and so for me they're irrelevant in this argument. The challenges for DDR, I think, one is the problem with the DDR in South Sudan is when I was in Nepal, for example, one of the things that you would see is that the cantonment sites were allocated, troops went to those sites and everybody submitted their weapons and put them in cantonments. The problem is with South Sudan is everything is very much about the talk. It's about, let's have this public display that peace is here. We'll colour cow, we'll colour, whatever, and then we'll move to those, we'll sort of move into those areas. The current plan, or the current plans for DDR before, were weak in the sense that it doesn't really hold the government more so accountable. So the SPLA-IO and its sort of coalition groups have assigned 23 cantonment sites. I think 2 weeks ago, it has to allocate a total of 40, but the government hasn't even bothered, saying where its cantonment sites are going to be. And so what you're seeing is one side doing it to look favourable in the international community's efforts, and the other side not doing it and not complying. The other thing is, if you're going to do DDR, all people and all actors have to do it, and so there has to be a willingness to want to do that. That hasn't happened, particularly on the government side. But for a lot of the breakout communities or groups, they're saying, well, actually, why am I going to surrender my weapons when the government's not going to bother? When, give it a week or so, they're about to attack us. And so the DDR has to be really independent. It has to be, people have to be willing to do it and support that process. If not, it's not going to work. And so that is pretty much what you're seeing now. It's for me, there is no real plan. There is talk of a DDR plan, but there is no real plan in place, because DDR is a process. There are steps that you take, and those steps haven't been decided. The terms for those steps haven't been agreed, and so you see one side trying to make an effort, because one, really, and this is where for me it's tricky, because that agreement isn't really in place. What you're likely to see is that the SPLA-IO is likely to use that as a way of mobilizing and actually bringing some of the breakout groups as part of its larger sort of focus to bring groups together. And what I mean is remobilize, and so use that as a way to gain resources and remobilize to actually to conduct attacks. And it's something that I think we need to be aware of, because if they do remobilize, it's likely that Juba will be taken if Uganda doesn't jump in. You have seen the pattern every time that the SPLA-IO mobilizes. If Uganda doesn't jump in, there will be a problem. I mean, Juba will be taken over. No doubt in 2013 that certainly was the case. In 2016, when I was there in Malakal trying to come home, the Upper Nile, for example, was taken by Johnson Aloni pretty much, and other states were taken over. If it wasn't for the Ugandan troops who came in within a space of a week, Juba would have been taken over. And so for me, the concern is, if there is no real plan or credible plan, we can have DDR and these groups are remobilizing, but actually what are the other side doing? And so that needs to be verified by an independent organisation, ideally UMIS, or some sort of wing of UMIS who deal with DDR specialists to be able to do it. That hasn't happened. And so for me, if there are no mechanisms for UMIS to do it, then how are you going to be able to do that, put that process into place?
In the back?
Hi, my name is Shazal. I'm from the UK Government Stabilisation Unit. My question is, you mentioned the international community supporting local level peace efforts, and obviously we know that the power is held with the elites who can initially reduce that violence. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of marrying, or that gap between the horizontal kind of power or peace efforts and then the vertical peace efforts, and how we can maybe play a role in that space.
I certainly think with the international community, one of the roles it could do is, there are a lot of partner organisations on the ground. There are many in this room here where you could actually connect to those groups who have partners on the ground who are implementing those sort of programs to support peace. I won't mention names, but I'm sure they'll come to you after. But again, you can do more with those organisations because they have downstream partners. And so for me, what I would like to see is less focus on the sort of leaders, because in essence, those leaders are going to keep on fighting unless those issues when it comes to the reforming of the SPLA and SPAM are sorted. This is something that's been going on since the 1980s, and so unless you deal with the root cause, this thing will just keep on manifesting itself over a generation again and again and again. So for me, it's what can we be doing on the ground with those communities to bring the different ethnic communities together, because there have been ethnic divides in some communities where you saw the Dinkas and Nuer cohabiting together, they no longer exist and they're fighting. So what can be done by those local partners to be able to support that process, but contribute to actually supporting some of the youth that are mobilised as part of the larger groups to say, actually, no, don't use violence. Think about these elements, think about peace, because for me that's where it's key. Solving South Sudan's issue isn't really about the generals; it's about the people, and solving, getting those people together to talk, to deal with those issues, and that's. For me, if that doesn't happen, then there's no point. You can spend all the money you want on the leaders. It's not going to resolve the issue.
Thank you. I think we had more questions, so I'll try maybe to group them together. Yes, please.
You spoke about the unwillingness of various parties. Oh, sorry. I'm Ben from Chedine.
Very diligent, thank you.
You spoke about the unwillingness of various parties to actually come together and negotiate peace because there just wasn't that sense of urgency there. But you also talked about the dire situation on the ground, the humanitarian conditions. What should we be looking out for that would indicate that there was a sort of change that would encourage these individuals to actually engage in genuine peace efforts? Is there some sort of loss of regional backing, or is this some sort of domestic change that would force these people to the table?
Should I take one more?
Yeah, you can take one.
Yeah, maybe I saw there were a couple of hands more. No?
Should we have a...
Yes? Oh, please.
Right, Andrew was pointing. My name is Tim Morris. I was the UK Special Representative to the Troika in 2014 and Ambassador in Juba 15 to 17. So Andrew and I were contemporaries in South Sudan. And well done. I mean, it's a terrific canter over the issues. I think every time those of us who've dealt with South Sudan try to talk about it, we just realise the huge complexity under the surface. Just two very quick comments. One is mental dislocation of the leaders. Some of these people are clinically in a situation, or observably I should say, because I'm not a doctor, but they're not in a situation where they are capable of certainly, let's say, certainly government, okay? They're not capable of government. They are living in a nightmare of their past, and they're frightened of getting killed, which is their main motivating factor. So greed and thievery and other things come with that. That makes it extraordinarily difficult to deal with, and it means it's extraordinarily difficult to rationalise how we do these things. I just pick you up on sanctions a little bit, or just say one thing, if I may, from the point of view of a government operative on this. We were trying to do this the whole time, and sanctions and the arms embargo were the two big campaigns we tried to lead in the Security Council. Remember, sanctions, there's only one sort of sanctions, and that's by the Security Council. There's one member of the Security Council who has basically malevolent policy towards Africa and would veto it. That's Russia. Okay? I'm recently a retired diplomat, and I'm happy to say but time and time again, that happened. Nonetheless, we were able to get through some sanctions measures. What I pick up a little bit on is the point about sanctioning generals. Washington lobby groups and people have tried to string together a case to prove that generals own houses in Uganda. It applies to an extent. But usually you find yourself, and we found ourselves in this position of sanctioning a bunch of people who weren't really interested in travelling. They mocked us basically for doing this and wore it as a badge of honour. So it has limited effectiveness as a subject. I'm sorry to make a comment.
No, it's fine.
That was great. Thank you, absolutely. Let's make sure we answer the very good question.
Yeah. I think one of the things, or one of the key indicators is, as I said, the willingness. I think peace in South Sudan is very much still seen as a ceremony. It's still seen as we come together and there's peace, and it's this instant thing. And I think what is key is, again, the moment of ripeness when all actors are willing and are ready to come to the table. There needs to be all actors willing to surrender their weapons and say, actually, we actively no longer want to be part of this violence and this conflict. That hasn't happened. You see it for one side, you don't see it for the other. There has to be a willingness. So, for example, I mentioned, just to go back, if I can do, all of these agreements, there's 7 in total, 14 since 1980s. All of these agreements were followed by either the creation of a new state or some sort of decree by the president. these are indicators of, in essence, something that isn't, a government that isn't willing to resolve these issues. And so, if you're really willing, then you wouldn't force through a decree. You would say, okay, let me wait for all of the parties to agree, and how can we move together as a coalition to form a transitional government of unity. For example, I remember being in 2016, Machar refusing to come to Juba, and then Taban Deng appointed the vice president of South Sudan. That isn't a way to support peace. And so it's these sort of indicators, as someone who's worked in the field, that I look for. Particularly, how does it impact the people on the ground? It's not just saying, well, peace has come, because that's normally the line. I mean, if you read anything on stuff on it, the leaders will say, peace has come, peace has come. But peace has come, what does that mean? I mean, it means laying down your weapons. It means actually we're willing to work together in partnership. We're willing to see ethnicity no longer as a hindrance, but actually as something that should be embraced. You can't reverse that by then saying, actually, we're going to create more states, because that creates more ethnic divides. And so, for me, there are those sort of indicators, basic indicators, that show that actually there's a willingness to move peace forward. And that still hasn't happened yet for me.
So to summarize and go back to what you were mentioning at the beginning, it would be an indicator of the fact that power is starting to be perceived not anymore as privilege and status, but more as something that you need in order to agree and compromise with others. Sort of this shift. And thank you very much for pointing to the psychological aspect, because I think I agree is key, especially in processes that rely so much on the leadership of some individuals at very crucial points. Because as political scientists, sometimes we forget about the peculiarities of the individual because they get swept under this idea of general trends and the systematic processes that we need to look at. But I completely agree, the individual aspect is fundamental. And of course, in situation of humongous trauma and violence, the psychological repercussions of that are very, very important.
But you just add to Tim's point as well. I mean, one of the things that is important to also note is that many of the current leaders are still fighters from the 1980s and beyond that. And so you are right to indicate that a lot of them have been traumatized. I mean, even the whole entire population. I mean, these are generations of people who are born into conflict that know nothing about conflict. I remember being in one of the POCs in Malakal when someone's family, had been attacked, and the person went back to kill the other person, and that person went to kill the other person, family member, and there was just not a constant back and forth of revenge. Just I need to kill somebody to basically feel that I've done something. And so that's pretty much how the South Sudanese people view things, and that's why, again, for me, that sort of going local. I don't use the word local, but that phrase, but actually focusing and bringing the communities together is important, not just at the national level, because the agreement does that. We've seen so many agreements in the past that focus at the national level but do nothing for the local level, because at the end of the day, when these agreements are put in place, it's the people that have to live together, and if that is not sorted, then you can't really trust those leaders to be able to do that.
Absolutely. I have a quick sum-up question, if there are no more questions from the audience. If you can just leave us with a very quick overview of what are the 1, 2, 3 scenarios that you think we could expect going forward, because I've been hearing you talking about these different possibilities, and I would like for you to just leave us with a snapshot of what these could be.
So I think there are 3 potential scenarios going forward. The first is the agreement will partially fail, with some staggering with the key players. Peace will be forced as it was in 2015, and things will be pushed through by presidential decree as it was in 2015 again. The government will exclude some of the key actors, as it did. This will create instability within the country. This will lead to further fragmentation, as we've seen in the diagram here. And also here, what you see is these various sort of rebel groups that have emerged pretty much from 2014 onwards, from these sort of indecisions. I think there's a very strong likelihood that the SPLA-IO will split. That is a very massive concern for me, not just because it's led by Riek Machar, but also because the SPLA-IO has its stakes in the Upper Nile, parts of Unity as well. And that for me is a concern because actually you have different mixes of groups in those areas. So that's one of the concerns for me. I think you're going to see in that first scenario as well the continuation of weak governance and a failed institutional structure. The second scenario, which I think is more likely, is that Machar and other leaders will return to Juba. Some have already started to return. The ceasefire deal will be broken again. It's already been broken anyway, so let's be clear on that. The agreement will totally fall apart, and the unity government will be forced through pretty much as it was before. Kiir rules by presidential decree as he's always been done. There will be no unified army, which is what Chedine was her concerns were about. Forces will not integrate, but there will be actual clashes. My biggest concern is when Machar returns and other leaders, how will they deal with the security in Juba? And I think that will really cause an outbreak of violence again. I think the implementation committees won't be able to resolve many of the high contentious issues, again, because there's so many issues and the time frame for them are so short. Fighting will break out in sporadic areas, but that will lead to more violence, as I said before. This time, however, I think there's going to be an all-out war, followed by a potential famine. Famine is on the horizon, and that will create a humanitarian crisis. My greatest concern is that a lot of people are saying people in South Sudan should return, but actually if they're returning and the government doesn't have any plan to support them or to help them, and people are nudging them back, actually that's really dangerous. And so that's what I think. I don't think the UN will be able to be prepared to deal with that situation. I think you're going to see massive waves of refugees and IDPs as well, and I think there's going to have to be a breakdown in sort of the oil production as well. That being because again, most of the rebel groups are in those locations as well. And I think elections will not occur as well. I think that's scenario sort of 2. Scenario 3, which is sort of just coming down, is again, I think partially the agreement succeeds, but again, there'll be a formation of unity government, but that probably will stall later on. The implementation committee won't solve some of the high contentious issues. The ceasefire will break down, but there will be an attempt to consolidate power very quickly. Fighting will break out in parts of the country, but again, for shorter periods as opposed to an all-out war as I described in scenario 2. There'll be more forced migration of civilians, particularly because that links to the elections that they want to hold in 3 years' time, and that will increase the likelihood or speed up the likelihood of violence against civilians. And so those are the sort of 3 scenarios I see going forward.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to everyone. Please send us your feedback and your comments. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you.